You never forget the smell. Not the blood, not the rot, not the cheap beer that seemed to hang in the air of that cramped apartment. I've worn this badge for almost 30 years, and I've seen my share of bodies pulled from rivers, car wrecks, even farm accidents that would make a grown man gag. But that place, apartment 213 on North 25th Street, that was something else entirely. My name doesn't matter much. You can call me Sheriff H. What matters is the case, the one that crawled under my skin and never left, the one with Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. Back then, Milwaukee was hurting. Drugs, poverty, gangs, all of it. But what haunted that city wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't gunfire or stick-ups. It was a quiet man, awkward, almost invisible in a crowd. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like the guy bagging your groceries, or the neighbor who mows his lawn too early on a Sunday. That was Dahmer's mask, and it worked. For years. The first time I heard his name, it was through a call that came in late July of '91. A patrol car had picked up a handcuffed kid, shirtless, terrified, shaking so bad he could barely talk. Said some man had tried to kill him. Claimed he barely got away. Normally, that's the kind of thing that ends up as just another ugly assault report, maybe tied up with drugs or prostitution. But something about the look in that boy's eyes made me pause. Pure, raw terror. We followed him back to the apartment. That's when the smell hit us. I've described it to folks since, and they never really get it. It wasn't just rot. It was heavy, almost sweet, like something burnt and spoiled all at once. My stomach turned before I even stepped through the door. Inside, Jesus. There were knives, photographs, bleach bottles stacked like trophies, and the fridge. God help me, that fridge. Inside were pieces, not food, not leftovers, pieces of men. Skulls lined up in the closet like they were collector's items. Polaroids, dozens of them, each worse than the last. Faces frozen in that moment between fear and silence. That was the night Jeffrey Dahmer's mask fell off. And I'll tell you this, once you've seen what I've seen, you start asking yourself, how did we miss him for so long? How did this man walk among us, smiling at his neighbors, holding down jobs, while building his own private graveyard behind a locked door? I'll take you through it, step by step. Because catching Dahmer wasn't just one lucky break. It was years of shadows, of missed chances, of bodies disappearing while the city looked the other way. And when we finally got him, it wasn't triumph I felt. It was something colder, like staring straight into the eyes of evil and realizing it had been there all along, waiting. And I'll never forget the first time I sat across from him, when he started to talk. You'd expect a man like Jeffrey Dahmer to fight, to deny, to squirm when the cuffs clicked shut on his wrists. But not him. He went quiet, almost relieved. Like he'd been waiting for someone to finally stop him. That silence, it was worse than any screaming. Because silence means control. And Dahmer, I would learn, had been all about control since he was a teenager. The deeper we dug, the more the timeline unfolded like a nightmare diary. His first kill? Back in 1978. 18 years old, fresh out of high school. He picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, took him home, gave him some drinks, and when Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer caved his skull in with a dumbbell. Just like that. He scattered the bones in the woods behind his house like they were garbage. Think about that. While most kids that age were figuring out college or jobs, Dahmer had already crossed a line most of us can't even imagine. And once you cross it, you don't come back. Through the 80s, he drifted. Military, odd jobs, moving from Ohio to Wisconsin. The drinking got worse, the urges sharper. His neighbors saw him as odd, but harmless. Quiet, polite. Sometimes too polite. That's how predators thrive. They don't look like wolves. They look like sheep. When he finally settled in that Oxford Apartments building, he had the perfect hunting ground. Men who slipped through the cracks. Young, often poor, often minorities, sometimes struggling with addiction. People the system ignored. People society didn't notice when they went missing. He'd lure them in with promises, money, alcohol, sometimes just a place to crash. And once they stepped inside apartment 213, that was it. There was no leaving. What haunted me most during those first days of investigation wasn't just the bodies. It was the trophies. Dahmer kept skulls, hearts, entire skeletons he was bleaching clean. He talked about building a shrine, a temple of bones where he could sit and feel power. And the Polaroids, Lord, each one was a frozen moment of cruelty. He wanted to remember every step, every victim. And here's the part that makes me sick to my stomach. We almost had him before. More than once. In May of 1991, just 2 months before his arrest, a 14-year-old boy escaped the apartment. Drugged, bleeding, incoherent. Neighbors called 911. Patrol officers showed up. They actually walked the boy back to Dahmer, who told them it was just a domestic fight with his partner. The officers believed him, handed the boy over. That kid was Conorak Synthesomphone. Hours later, he was dead. That one still burns, because it shows how close evil was and how blind we were. How Dahmer played on prejudice, on assumptions, on the system's cracks to keep killing. By the time we sat him down in interrogation, we weren't just uncovering murders. We were unraveling the story of a man who had blended in for over a decade, leaving behind a trail of vanished faces that no one connected. Until that night in July. Until that boy ran into the street in handcuffs and begged for help. And when Dahmer finally started talking, it wasn't rage. It wasn't regret. It was cold, steady, like he was reading a grocery list. That's when I knew. I wasn't dealing with just a killer. I was face to face with something much darker. I've sat across from killers before. Seen the bluster, the excuses, the tears that come when the walls close in. But Dahmer, he wasn't like them. He didn't cry, didn't shout. He didn't even ask for a lawyer. He just looked at us with those pale eyes, steady, almost grateful, like he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to finally listen. And then he began. The words came slow at first, clipped, matter of fact. But as the hours passed, he started to open up. And what spilled out was colder than anything I'd ever heard. He described the killings in detail. How he drugged the men, how he posed their bodies, how he took photographs before and after. He spoke of dismemberment the way a mechanic might talk about fixing an engine. Step 1, step 2, step 3. But there was something else underneath it all. Control. That was his obsession. He didn't just want his victims dead. He wanted them silent, obedient, frozen in time. That's why he kept the skulls, the bones, the photos. He wanted to build a world where they could never leave him. At one point, he leaned forward and told us about the drilling, how he'd experimented with pouring acid into the skulls of some victims, trying to make what he called zombies, living bodies without will, without memory, who would never abandon him. I had to keep my face straight, but inside, I felt sick. Not just from the horror of it, but from the way he described it. Calm, clinical, as if it were a science project gone wrong. And then came the shrine, his dream. He wanted to collect enough skulls, enough bones, to build a black table in his bedroom, surrounded by candles, with a throne where he could sit and feel power over death itself. I remember my partner shifting in his chair, crossing his arms, trying to act tough. But I saw the sweat on his forehead. I felt it myself. We weren't just hearing about murders. We were staring into the blueprint of madness. The thing that shook me most wasn't just what Dahmer did, but who he was while saying it. No twitching, no nerves, just a soft, steady voice. Sometimes, he even sounded sad. Sad that the shrine hadn't been finished. Sad that he failed at keeping his victims with him. Sad for himself, not for them. We asked him about remorse, about whether he ever thought of stopping. And he said something that's carved into my memory like it was etched in stone. I couldn't stop. I tried, but it felt like it was all I had left. There was no thrill in his voice, no joy, just emptiness, as if killing had become the only way he knew how to exist. When I finally left that room, the hallway lights seemed too bright, too sterile. My stomach turned. My hands shook, though I tried not to show it, because the truth had settled in. Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't just a man who killed 17 people. He was a reminder that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, wears glasses, holds down a job, and smiles at the neighbors. And as I drove home that night, I kept hearing his voice, calm, steady, unforgettable. I knew then this case would haunt me forever. The city changed after Dahmer. You can feel it in the air, like Milwaukee itself was holding its breath. The trial began in January of '92, and the courthouse was a pressure cooker. Families of the victims lined the benches, their grief filling every corner of that room. Journalists from around the world packed the aisles, shoving microphones, scribbling notes. And in the middle of it all sat Jeffrey Dahmer, pale, quiet, hands folded neatly in front of him. 17 counts of murder. 17 lives taken apart, piece by piece. I watched those families stare at him, and I'll tell you, there aren't words for that kind of pain. Mothers, fathers, brothers. Some of them wanted justice. Some wanted blood. All of them wanted answers. How could this man, this soft-spoken nobody, destroy so many lives and slip past us for so long? When Dahmer pled guilty, there was no drama, no tears, no breakdown. Just that same calm voice, admitting to horrors that made hardened detectives shift in their seats. He spoke like a man reciting a grocery list, item after item, life after life. The prosecution laid it out for the jury. The Polaroids, the skulls, the confessions. Every gruesome detail was dragged into the light. and I swear, you could feel the weight of it pressing down on everyone in that room. At night, I'd go home and close my eyes, and all I could see were those photographs. Those frozen faces staring back at me, begging for justice. Then came the sentencing. One life sentence wouldn't have been enough. Not for what he did. The judge stacked them. 15 consecutive life terms. Over 900 years behind bars. And when the gavel came down, you'd think there'd be relief. Closure. But it wasn't like that. The families wept, yes, but there was no sense of victory. Because no sentence could bring those boys and men back. What struck me most was Dahmer's statement. He stood there, voice soft, almost trembling, and said he wished he could die. He admitted he knew he deserved no freedom, no peace. He claimed he'd tried to fight the urges, but failed. Some in the crowd said they saw remorse. I didn't. What I saw was a man stripped of his mask, realizing he'd never again be in control. And yet, even behind bars, the shadow of Dahmer lingered. Parents told their kids not to trust strangers. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. You couldn't walk past the Oxford apartments without feeling a chill crawl up your spine. People locked their doors tighter, looked over their shoulders more often. Evil had lived right among us, behind thin apartment walls, and no one had noticed until it was too late. For me, the trial wasn't closure. It was a reminder that monsters don't always hide under the bed. Sometimes they rent an apartment, go shopping, wave to the folks next door. Sometimes they live quiet lives until the day they don't. And as the bars closed on Jeffrey Dahmer, I thought it was over, that the nightmares would fade. But I was wrong, because the story didn't end in that courtroom. Most cases end when the judge slams the gavel and the prisoner is led away. But with Dahmer, it was never that simple. Even locked behind bars, his shadow stretched long. I remember the day the call came in, November 28th, 1994. Jeffrey Dahmer was dead, beaten to death, in prison by another inmate named Christopher Scarver. The guards found him in the bathroom, his head crushed with a metal bar. Just like that, it was over. Some folks celebrated. I remember one victim's family member saying it was the first good night of sleep they'd had in years. Others said justice had finally been served. But me, I didn't feel relief. I felt something colder, because death was the one thing Dahmer had been chasing all along. In that final statement at trial, he said he wanted to die, that he didn't deserve to live. And in the end, prison gave him what he asked for. I went to see the aftermath, the reports, the photographs. And once again, there it was, the silence. Even in death, Dahmer looked calm, almost peaceful. And that chilled me more than the crime scenes ever did. Evil shouldn't look at peace. The Oxford apartments were torn down not long after, but you can still drive past that empty lot. Grass grows where those walls once stood, but the ground feels heavier there, like it remembers. People cross the street rather than walk past it. Some things leave a stain no demolition can erase. And as for me, I carry it still. The faces of the victims, the smell of that apartment, the sound of Dahmer's steady voice as he described horrors no man should be able to speak of so plainly. At night, I sometimes hear that voice in my dreams, calm as ever, whispering details I wish I could forget. But the part that haunts me most isn't what Dahmer did. It's how ordinary he looked doing it. A man who blended into the crowd, who went to work, bought groceries, shook hands with neighbors. A man who was invisible until he wasn't. And that's why I tell this story. Not to glorify him, but to remind you, evil doesn't always come with fangs or fire. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it lives next door. And sometimes it shakes your hand. That's the case I'll never leave behind. Jeffrey Dahmer. Apartment 213. And God help me, I still see it when I close my eyes.